In the second video in our series on the War of the Ring, we described how the Númenórean kingdoms of men, Arnor and Gondor, fared in the Third Age. But the War of the Ring was truly an event of continental scale, and the northern portion of Middle-earth had its own battles. In this video, we'll talk about the Dorvan kingdom of Erebor, its rise and fall, the coming of the wizards to Middle-earth, the reappearance of Sauron and the One Ring, and the Battle of the Five Armies, which would prove to be pivotal in the War of the Ring. Welcome to the Wizards and Warriors channel. If you want to be immersed in an epic fantasy world, the sponsor of this video, Raid Shadow Legends, is a great choice. You've all heard the memes, but Raid is genuinely one of the greatest mobile games out there, and you can download it for free via the link in the description. The newest boss just released in Raid is the biggest and craziest yet. It's a Hydra with 6 different heads, each a battle all on its own. The Head of Suffering is all about making you suffer with its special skill called Pain Link. If you hurt it, you're going to suffer as well. The Head of Torment specializes in using true fear to drag down your team, making you skip your turns and lose access to your skills. We love that Raid has so many colorful champions to choose from, allowing for endless combinations and tactics. And if Hydra isn't enough, Raid's also giving away a super limited edition champion. Some of you may recognize him already, it's esports legend and Navi superstar Simple. Until January 28th, Simple's limited edition champ is available for free. All you have to do is log in for 7 days between now and January 28th. There's never been a better time to get started. Use our link in the description or scan our QR code to get a free starter pack worth almost $30 to kickstart your game. A free champion Rector Drath, 200,000 silver, 1 energy refill and 1 XP boost, and 1 ancient shard so you can summon awesome champions immediately. All this treasure will be waiting for you here. Dorvan peoples began to rise in prominence in the northern part of Middle-earth following the culmination of the War in the North and the destruction of the Kingdom of Arnor at the hands of the Witch King. This brave and hardy folk provided a counterbalance to what could have potentially formed an overwhelming force of orcs and goblins in the northern realms. Chief among Dorvan realms in wealth and significance was the Kingdom of Erebor, situated in the Lonely Mountain overlooking the human settlement of Dale. While Durin's folk had discovered significant mineral deposits and begun the early process of establishing a settlement here as far back as the Second Age, the importance of this realm was only truly felt following the fall of Khazad-dûm, more commonly known as Moria. The dwarves in this kingdom had delved too deep and too greedily, and had awakened a remnant of the First Age, a Balrog of Morgoth, who drove the dwarves from their homes in the Misty Mountains. So, in the year TA 1999, King Thrain I led his people to the Lonely Mountain, becoming the first king under the mountain. The minerals and precious stones they found here made the people of Erebor immensely wealthy. Chief among their possessions was the Arkenstone, a jewel of incredible beauty which was discovered deep within the mountain and for the next 211 years would be the emblem of the kingdom. This was until King Thorin I led his people to the Grey Mountains to rejoin their kin. They were soon set upon by the dragons who lived in this region, and the costly conflict forced the dwarves to abandon the Grey Mountains in TA 2590. The dwarves went their own ways, with Gror I and his followers settling in the region of the Iron Hills, and Thorin's great-grandson Thror returning to the Lonely Mountain to assume the title of King under the Mountain. Once more the kingdom prospered, becoming the envy of all who came into contact with it, among them those with dark intentions. Thror continued to rule ably, joined by his son Thrain II and grandson Thorin II, who ensured that the line of succession would be maintained in the coming years. The future seemed to be bright, despite the increasing greed of the dwarves, in particular Thror, who now saw the Arkenstone as taking precedence above all else. Everything was to change in TA 2770. On a warm afternoon, as Thorin was out hunting, a gigantic shadow engulfed them, and they glimpsed the immense shape of a great drake, the last great dragon of Middle-earth, Smaug. Riding towards Erebor, Thorin witnessed what had hours earlier been determined impenetrable defences torn asunder. The city of Dale lay in ruin, having been devastated by waves of flame, and the people of Erebor now found themselves exiled from their homes once more. Great death and destruction ensued as Smaug carved his way, making his home in the Great Vault of Erebor, which was filled with gold and jewels, along with the Arkenstone. Thror, his son Thrain, and several companions managed to escape through a side door and join up with the thousands of survivors who Thorin had successfully brought to safety following his delayed return from his hunting trip. The majority of the survivors relocated to the Iron Hills, joining their cousins, while the rest, led by Thror, exiled themselves in the hills of Dunland. Thror found himself immensely depressed by his inability to find a true home for his people, so he gave the last surviving Dorvan Ring of Power and a detailed map of the Lonely Mountain, which included the locations of several secret entrances and passes, alongside a key to open such, to his son, and alongside one companion, Na, travelled towards Moria. Arriving at the eastern gate, Thror, despite the urging of his companion, passed through the open entrance to the ancestral home of the Dorvan folk. Thror was killed by the local orcs, while Na was captured. He was allowed to return to his people with a message that dwarves will only find death in Moria, which was now ruled by Azog. The message was returned to Thrain III, who sat in silence for 7 days, before deciding that the murder must be answered, beginning the War of Dwarves and Orcs. Between TA 2790 and 2793, he amassed all the warriors the other holds could spare. Then Thrain led his men to avenge his father. As they marched, the dwarves took every goblin hold from Methredeth to Gundabad, slaughtering their denizens. The war's climax came in the year TA 2799, as the Dorvan host emerged upon the same valley that Thror had been slain in years earlier, battle-hardened and prepared to do what was required. This would become known as the Battle of Azanul Bizar, and the fighting was fierce, with neither side willing to give an inch, the fury of the dwarves matched by the cruel strength which had been gifted to the orcs. Yet the wound of Thror's death, and the deaths of so many others during the preceding war, pushed Durin's folk ever onwards. The battle hung on a knife's edge, with Thorin almost dying in the melee as his shield was shattered, before hefting a large piece of oak and beating back his foes with it, earning the moniker Oakenshield. It was at this point that the dwarves of the Iron Hills arrived, crashing the right flank of the Orcish host, driving them all the way back to the gate of Moria. With casualties mounting on either side, Lord of the Iron Hills, Nain, cried out for the Orcish leader, who fled into Moria to fight him. Returning from his flight, Azog engaged the Dorvan leader in single combat. Despite his valour, the elderly dwarf could not match the sheer strength of Azog, and was slain as his son Dain II Ironfoot looked on helplessly. Immediately, Dain rushed up the steps, avoiding the blow of the gigantic orc, while simultaneously landing a heavy blow to his knee. He then decapitated the slayer of his father with a fell stroke of his axe, ending the war and cementing his legacy amongst Durin's folk. Most of the orcs and half of the dwarves were slain in the battle. The aftermath was brutal for the dwarves, with half their number slain, with many prominent Longbeards dead. Thrain himself lost an eye and was left with a limp. Despite this, he urged his people to continue the conflict and take back Moria, with only the wisdom of the new Lord of the Iron Hills preventing them from this ruinous course of action. Meanwhile, the son of Azog, Bolg, swore vengeance against the dwarves. Thrain then relocated the remainder of his people to the Blue Mountains, where they began to prosper. The ring had made Thrain restless, and in TA 2841 he left Thorin as the leader of his people and began a journey with a number of his comrades, hopeful to reconquer the Lonely Mountain. At this point in time, unbeknownst to the free peoples of Middle-earth, Sauron had returned. Posing as a necromancer, he instructed his followers to kidnap Thrain, who was brought to the stronghold of Dol Guldur in the south of Mirkwood. Here he was tortured for information, his Ring of Power was taken, and he was left to wander the land a broken soul. The stirrings of the rings, and the appearance of the necromancer, prompted the Valar to send 5 Maiar to Middle-earth, where they took the shape of old wizards. One of them, Gandalf the Grey, was sent on a mission from the White Council, a group of the most powerful beings in Middle-earth entrusted with its protection, to investigate Dol Guldur. He met with the former king and was given the key and map to the Lonely Mountain, which he promised to pass to Thorin. Gandalf also discovered that the necromancer was Sauron, and urged the White Council to attack while he was weak. However, another wizard, Saruman, urged caution. Gandalf then sought out Thorin, who had begun to work as a mercenary in order to aid his people. It was at Bree he would meet the King Under the Mountain in exile. Gandalf promised he would aid Thorin in reclaiming his throne, a cause he spoke of ardently, and with such passion it swayed the wizard. Gandalf began to make his preparations, sending Thorin with a company of 12 dwarves, Fili, Kili, Dwalin, Balin, Oin, Gloin, Dori, Nori, Ori, Beaver, Bofer, and Bomber to meet at Bag End in the Shire. Here they hired an unwilling hobbit, Bilbo Baggins, to operate as their burglar in their plan to infiltrate the Lonely Mountain and retake their treasure. Setting out from the Shire, the group met with a multitude of perils, nearly being eaten by trolls until the intervention of Gandalf, as well as being ambushed by orcs, wargs, and spiders. During this early period, they uncovered the legendary weapons Glamdring and Orcrist, which had been forged during the First Age in Gondolin, with Gandalf taking the former, and despite the typical Dorvan misgiving of elvish weapons, Thorin taking the latter. The company rested in Rivendell, where Elrond helped Gandalf with the translation of the runes on the map which Thror had bestowed upon his descendants. The side passage was 5 feet tall, and capable of allowing 3 dwarves to walk abreast, though unfortunately the keyhole could only be found on Durin's Day, when the setting sun and last moon of autumn would shine their light upon it. Gandalf's group then headed eastwards towards the Misty Mountains, where they unknowingly camped on the front porch of Goblin Town, and were captured by the denizens of Moria. Gandalf, who had evaded capture, orchestrated an escape, killing the Great Goblin and freeing the dwarves, who then fought their way out of the town. Bilbo, however, was knocked unconscious, but due to his size, was ignored by the goblins and managed to crawl to safety, finding a small ring in the process. Continuing down the tunnel, Bilbo met a former river hobbit, Gollum, who now had been in possession of the ring for well over 500 years at this point. This led to a contest of riddles, with Bilbo's life on the line, which he won. Gollum tried to attack Bilbo, but the latter had discovered the power of the ring and turned invisible, allowing him to escape and reunite with his companions. Unfortunately, the company was now being chased by goblins and wargs, and was forced to flee to the top of a number of pine trees. Gandalf began to set pine cones alight and hurl them at his foes, which unfortunately began to set the surrounding landscape alight. Without the intervention of the Eagles of Manwë, the company may not have survived the encounter. The Eagles brought them to their eyrie. They then travelled to the house of Bjorn, a skin changer, who either appeared as a large, hairy, powerful man or a gigantic, ferocious bear. At this point, Gandalf departed to join the White Council in an assault on Dol Guldur. Despite the difficulties, they managed to drive Sauron to his long-prepared keep of Barad-dûr. Meanwhile, Bjorn provided the remainder of the party with ponies to reach Mirkwood, where they encountered giant spiders and fought them. The Wood Elves of King Thranduil living in the area intervened, capturing the dwarves, citing the previous animosity as precedent. Bilbo escaped using the ring. He infiltrated Thranduil's hall and was able to break the dwarves out of the prison, making use of barrels to traverse a river and reach Lake Town in Dale, now a small settlement of men which Smaug would attack every once in a while. Support for the Dorvan company was overwhelming, allowing them to rest and recuperate there for a number of weeks before pressing on. The company reached the side door depicted in Thror's map in time for Durin's Day, allowing Thorin to open the door. Bilbo, who went forward alone as a scout, discovered that Smaug was awake. The dragon sensed the hobbit, but the power of the ring kept his presence shrouded. During his surveillance, Bilbo noticed a small chink in the armour of Smaug's underbelly. Smaug soon discovered that Bilbo was attempting to steal a goblet, causing him to go into a rage and fly out of the fortress. Bilbo urged the company to enter through the side door and seal it behind them, saving their lives as Smaug set the entire area alight. Bilbo told the company of Smaug's intentions to destroy Lake Town, and this was overheard by a thrush, whose language the Dale men could understand, and the bird flew to inform the final descendant of the former lords of Dale, Bard the Bowman. The latter had organized a company of archers to fight Smaug, who attacked Lake Town. When Bard was down to his last arrow, the thrush landed on his shoulder and whispered of Smaug's weakness. Fortunately for the forces of good, Bard's final arrow was the Black Arrow of Dale, an heirloom of Lord Girion of Dale, forged by King Thror himself prior to the fall of Erebor. Bard launched this relic of a former age and managed to hit the weak spot dead center. The last great dragon of Middle-earth died immediately, falling from the sky and destroying Lake Town in its entirety. Meanwhile, the company had fortified Erebor, and Bilbo had uncovered the Arkenstone. However, seeing the change in Thorin's demeanor, and evidencing the same weakness which had poisoned his forefathers, Bilbo kept the jewel from him. Word reached them of the death of Smaug. However, this joy did not last long. The angered King Thranduil had arrived with a large force, lending his support to Bard and his men in their claims of recompense due to the destruction of the town at the hands of the dragon the dwarves had awakened. Greed and hatred had poisoned Thorin's noble heart, however, and he refused the claims of man and elf alike, preferring to defend behind the walls of Erebor, while simultaneously sending a raven to his relative, Dain, Lord of the Iron Hills, for support. In the meantime, he ordered the company to search for the Arkenstone, while also pulling Bilbo aside to award him with a shirt of mithril, an exceedingly expensive material, as a reward for his bravery throughout the quest. This affection did not last, as Bilbo, hoping to avoid conflict, gave the Arkenstone to Bard and Thranduil before returning to the mountain to inform Thorin of his actions. The latter perceived this as treachery, banishing the hobbit, who rejoined the newly returned Gandalf among the elven host. Meanwhile, Dain organized a company of 500 heavily armored, battle-hardened veterans of the War of the Dwarves and Orcs, and soon arrived, leading to a stalemate between the three armies assembled. On the Elvish side were 1,000 highly competent and peerless elven spearmen and swordsmen, supported by some 500 archers, and accompanied by 300 militiamen of Lake Town, led by Thranduil and Bard respectively. A battle almost ensued between both companies, had it not been for the intervention of Gandalf, who informed them that innumerable hordes of goblins, led by Bolg, were now marching directly towards them, incited by previous hatreds alongside the slaying of the Great Goblin. Dain, Thranduil and Bard agreed that the oncoming host of orcs, wargs and bats, which outnumbered them massively, should be their core concern. The generals lined their forces at the spurs of the mountain, with the dwarves and men on the left and the elves on the right. A light rearguard was placed in between these two forces in order to entice the orcs to attack, allowing them to be encircled and destroyed. Bilbo attempted to sit out the battle on the elven-held Ravenhill, where he was accompanied by Gandalf. The fighting ensued as the orcs and wargs crashed forward, with the bats supporting them like a sea of locusts. Initially, the allied plan worked perfectly, as the enemy vanguard rushed to the choke point in the center, taking massive losses. However, the sheer weight of numbers ensured this advantage was not held for long on the part of the allied forces. The second wave was far worse, with orcs scaling the sides of the spurs to attack the free folk from the side and rear, while the main wave engaged them from their initial starting point. The allies were hard pressed and were barely surviving the onslaught, and it seemed that the battle would soon be over. It was at this point a great shout went up from the lonely mountain. Thorin Oakenshield finally realized the folly of his ways and crashed forwards with his fellow companions. Their emergence upon the battlefield inspired the free folk. Their charge was so unexpected, and the weapons and armor uncovered within Erebor so effective, that the company pushed its way through the entirety of the Orcish center, rallying their faltering allies as they passed. Here, they eventually reached the monumentally sized bodyguards of Bolg, through whom they could not force their way. Battle lines and tactics soon devolved into an unorganized and chaotic melee, with no quarter being given on either side, and it seemed as if a stalemate had ensued, which would ultimately favour the Orcs, who outnumbered the valorous of the dwarves, men and elves who stood together on that day. It was at this point Bilbo let out the cry, "The eagles are coming." Indeed, the Lord of the Great Eagles, Gwaihir, had led hundreds of his kind to aid the free folk in their desperate conflict, just as the tide had begun to turn against them. This shout was taken up by the entirety of the allied force, before Bilbo was unfortunately knocked unconscious by a stray rock to the head. The battle began to swing finally in favour of the free folk, as the eagles decimated the Orcish lines in swooping manoeuvres, relieving much of the pressure placed upon both spurs and Thorin in the centre. However, the engagement, that would later be called the Battle of the Five Armies, was truly won when Bjorn arrived in his form of a bear of gargantuan size and crashed into the goblin kind. Just at this point, Thorin attempted to break through and slay Bolg, but was mortally wounded in the attempt. Bjorn, seeing this, brushed through the Orcish lines in order to carry Thorin's broken body to safety. Seeing the wounded king under the mountain and further enraged by it, Bjorn returned to the fray, filled with wrath and seeking vengeance. He smashed the ranks of Bolg's bodyguards before slaying the mighty Orc himself in single combat, destroying the morale of the Orcs, who were left as easy pickings for the battered but unbroken free folk to decimate. Panicking and scattering, they were slaughtered en masse, with many more losing their lives in Mirkwood as Thranduil's people showed them no mercy. Soon after the battle, Thorin succumbed to his wounds. Before he did so, however, he reconciled with Bilbo, ultimately stating, "If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. But, sad or merry, I must leave it now. Farewell." The battle had been won, but at a massive cost. The free folk suffered heavy casualties, including Thorin, King Under the Mountain, and his nephews Fili and Kili, among many other men, elves and dwarves. Whereas on the part of the Orcs, the casualties were catastrophic, with very few of them surviving, shattering the power of the Orcs in the north, and denying Sauron a further power base for the Great War which was to come. The Kingdom Under the Mountain was reformed, with the titles of King Under the Mountain and King of Durin's folk passing to Dain, while the Kingdom of Dale was restored, with Bard as its new king, who went on to rebuild Lake Town, which became a thriving capital. These two newly reformed nations would become true bastions of the north in the ensuing war against Sauron. While Gandalf had achieved all of his goals, foremost among them the destruction of Smaug, who Sauron could have used to devastating effect during the War of the Ring. This brings us to the events detailed within the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and our next video on Middle-earth will cover the true beginning of the War of the Ring. We're planning to cover the battles of many other fantasy, sci-fi and space opera universes, so make sure you have subscribed and pressed the bell button. Please consider liking and sharing, as it helps immensely, and don't forget to comment. We'll try to read and respond to every comment, as we want to know what you think about this video and which videos you hope to see in the future. This is the Wizards and Warriors channel, and we'll catch you on the next one.